The Chronicles of the 63rd Infantry Division, April 4th to 5th, 1945. April 4th, the 861st Field Artillery was in the town of Billigheim where WWII were bombed by German planes, and they found that champagne will not put out a fire caused by a bomb in the tarp of a 1/2-ton truck. During the day, the batteries fired 10-24 rounds in all directions in an attempt to quiet the opposing artillery and mortar fire. Meantime, the 863rd Field Artillery moved into positions in the vicinity of Adelsheim. The 718th Field Artillery, which had been attached to the 863rd since Heidelberg, was relieved from attachment and reassigned to the 861st Field Artillery to support the 253rd Infantry. The 862nd Field Artillery, following the main force of the 254th Infantry, moved from Oberschefflenz to Osterburken, arriving shortly before noon. They immediately began to set up their communication net when they received word that a railroad train of political prisoners had been discovered in their area. Investigating troops from the 254th Infantry had found the train, which had been in a rail yard for 5 days. The prisoners were packed 40 to 60 to a car, which left practically no room to sit or rest, and they had been locked in the cars with no food or water for the 5-day period. Their SS guards had left the train only an hour or so before, leaving a few men as a delaying force, which was quickly dispersed by a small infantry unit. The captives were in very poor physical condition. Some had died and many others were too weak to stand and were lying in heaps on the railcar floors. The stench of urine and human feces was overpowering. Colonel Warren's men provided the pitiful unfortunates with shelter, clothing, and the first decent food that they had eaten in months. This was the 63rd Infantry Division's first encounter with the plight of the displaced persons and political prisoners in Germany, and it served to confirm the many rumors which had spread throughout the army regarding the inhuman treatment of gypsies, Jews, and others in the concentration camps. On April 4th, the 255th Infantry had proceeded directly east from Mosbach and moved through the 254th Infantry line at Oberschefflenz and moved forward, while encountering light resistance to a line extending from Billigheim through Reassigned and on to Adelsheim. The next day, the 255th Regiment moved south into its Jagst Rive, positions at Jagsthausen, Bieringen, Berlichingen, Wittern, and their environs. Elements of the 254th Regiment moved further east into positions in the various small towns and open areas along the north side of the Jagst around Krautheim and Dorzbach during the period from April 4th to April 6th. The stage was set for the critical battle for the heights between Jagst and the Kocher Rivers. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division occupied the high ground from Jagstfeld to the western half of the Harthauser Wald opposite the 253rd Infantry and the 3rd Battalion of the 255th Infantry. Further to the east of the 17th SS PGD was the 553rd Volks Grenadier Division, the Pioneer Regiment, Rosenheim, and miscellaneous battle groups. After a delay of some 6 hours resulting from the entrapment of the platoon of engineers, additional assault boats were provided by a company of the 263rd Engineers to the crossing area. At 0355 on April 4th, 1945, the 2nd Battalion of the 253rd Regiment crossed the Jagst River in assault boats near Adelsheim under an extremely heavy concentration of German artillery, mortar, and Nebelwerfer fire. The 2nd Battalion moved out to the southwest, and the 1st Battalion of the 253rd Regiment followed immediately to the same crossing area. The heavy concentration of enemy artillery and mortar fire continued as it crossed the river in assault boats and moved out to the east along the south bank of the river. Company C, 253rd Infantry, moved to the southern edge of the wooded area adjacent to the river and west of Herbolzheim. Company B, 253rd Infantry, moved through the woods and into the town of Herbolzheim, while Company A moved into and occupied the town of Untergriesheim. D, Company moved a mortar platoon into Untergriesheim and a machine gun platoon into Herbolzheim. The attack was slowed by the heavy concentration of Nebelwerfers and artillery fire. Nebelwerfers, which the infantry called screaming meme eyes, were rockets normally used as attack weapons against cities, but in this case they were used against the infantry. Bill Malden said that the doggy becomes a specialist on shells after he has been in the line for a while. Sometimes he hates those that come straight at him, like the 88s, more than those that drop, because the high ones give him more warning. On the other hand, if the flat trajectory one misses him, it keeps on traveling while the dropped one can kill even if it misses by dozens of yards. Some shells scream, some with some whistle, and others whir. Most flat trajectory shells sound like rapidly ripped canvas. Howitzer shells seem to have a two-tone whisper. Most dog faces would like to get their hands on the guy who invented the 88, because the shell arrives almost without warning. Malden was absolutely correct. The 12th TAC bombed Adelsheim and made 4 reconnaissance sorties in an attempt to locate the German artillery and heavy mortar positions. In the meantime, the 2nd Battalion, 253rd Infantry, had moved to occupy the high ground near the town of Willenbach. The troopers of the 38th Panzer Grenadier Regiment held to their positions tenaciously and counterattacked many times in an attempt to move the 1st and 2nd Battalions back from their bridgehead. Small arms fire and artillery continued to fall on Herbolzheim, Untergriesheim, the woods, and the high ground to the southwest all night long. During the day, a company of the 263rd Engineers made repeated attempts to construct a ferry operation over the Jagst, utilizing infantry support raft equipment, which they had moved from Hasmersheim on the Neckar. Heavy concentrations of German artillery prevented the successful installation of the ferry until well into the night. The ferry finally allowed some heavier equipment, such as anti-tank weapons, access to the battle area. Baker, battery of the 863rd Field Artillery, was positioned in Adelsheim, but with only a very few targets because the line was so fluid in their area. On the day before, the regiment was near a state farm at Simmerhof where the Polish inmates had slaughtered a calf for them. The cooks chose this opportunity of inactivity to grill the steaks for everyone. The next day would be a different story. However, April 5th, 1945, on the following morning, Company C, 253rd, attempted to extricate itself from its low exposed position in the woods along the river by making a frontal advancement up the hillside before it and across the open fields. This was to no avail, and the advance was stopped by artillery emanating from the vicinity of Degmarn and by mortar and small arms fire coming from the high ground. As soon as it broke into the open, C Company was pinned down until nightfall. The artillery was silenced by an air attack by P-47s which bombed and strafed Degmarn and Edheim. A Company, 263rd Engineers, worked hard under mortar and small arms fire to construct an infantry support bridge across the river near Untergriesheim, while they continued to maintain the ferry operation a short distance away. At the same time, the 1271 SD Engineer Battalion worked on a Bailey bridge in the same area. This bridge was finally completed in the afternoon, and tank destroyers from the 822nd Tank Destroyer Battalion and tanks from the 753rd Tank Battalion crossed the river to support the 253 RD Infantry. Baker, battery of the 863rd FA, had now moved to Weigentel. The very heavy rain had turned the ground into a sea of mud, which made the task of gun emplacement difficult indeed. A self-propelled artillery piece was attached to the battery, increasing its strength to 5 guns. The battery fired all day long in support of the 255th Infantry Regiment, which was approaching the Jagst River line east of Machmal, with the hostilities only a few kilometers from Kressbach. The teacher, her Spaman, reflected. On Thursday, several very young wounded came back into the village. In the shelter of her Schwanzer's house, they applied an emergency dressing. I showed them to the dressing station, which is in Fritz Muller's cellar. Towards midday, 2 SS troop leaders bring their captain with a stomach wound into the cellar and apply an emergency dressing. Then they take him on a stretcher to the dressing station. The artillery spotter pilots noticed it, so we catch an intensified barrage. The French prisoners of war have long since been taken away, and the Wehrmacht troops have also marched off. Only SS are left in the village. If these also went completely, at least the war would steer clear of here.